In this video, I'm going to be responding to Tom Pennington's case for cessationism. I want to show that even if we accept all 7 of his arguments, it still does not follow that the gifts of the Spirit have certainly ceased. I'm Cole, and this is Practical Faith. Stay tuned. If you haven't already seen my first video where I cite the biblical case for the gifts, you can click up here as you might want to watch that first. I think that Tom Pennington did a good job outlining 7 cessationist arguments. And in this video, I'm not going to be able to hit all of his subpoints. So if you want to check out the full video, I'll put the link in the description below. I'm going to allow him to introduce each of his 7 arguments and then talk about them one by one. So let's get started.
I want to lay out for you 7 biblical arguments for cessationism. The first biblical argument for cessationism is the unique role of miracles.
He argues that there were only 3 primary periods in biblical history where God worked miracles through individuals. They were the time of Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. And the miracles that God worked through these men validated their messages. While there were lots of miracles scattered throughout biblical history, I can admit that it seems like the majority took place within those 3 biblical time frames. I'll also agree that they did validate the messages of the messengers. But what bearing does that have on the gifts of the Spirit today? The working of miracles is only one of 9 gifts of the Spirit. And if you take into account all of the different ways that God moved in and through people, like visions and prophecies, dreams and healings, then the whole Bible is saturated with God moving in ways that resemble the New Testament gifts. And that's my other point. These gifts are for the church. The church was not established until after Jesus died and rose from the dead. So all of the events that happened pre-church don't really have any bearing on the gifts that were given to the church. It was not until Acts chapter 2 that the power of the Spirit was poured out upon all flesh. And now sons and daughters, servants, handmaidens, everyone has access to the power of the Spirit.
A second related argument to that is the end of the gift of apostleship.
He argues that apostles were a gift to the church, and there are no modern-day apostles in the same sense of the original 12 apostles. One of the requirements to be among the 12 was to have witnessed the resurrected Christ. And because no one today has witnessed the resurrected Christ, no one today is an apostle. This gift has ceased. And because this gift can cease, then it means that any of the other gifts can cease as well. I can agree that there are no apostles today in the same sense as the original 12. But even in the Bible, we find other people being called apostles, like Paul and Barnabas in Acts 14, verse 14. I think we can also make a good case for James, Timothy, Silvanus, and a few others. The word apostle just means a sent one. And I believe that this gift is still operating in the church today, only we don't refer to them as apostles. Most of the time we refer to them as missionaries or church planters. But even if he's right and there are no modern day apostles, period, it does not follow that any of the other gifts have ceased.
The third argument for cessationism is the foundational nature of the New Testament apostles and prophets.
The apostles had a specific role and they were specially gifted to complete it. And they completed it. So it's done and we don't need apostles or prophets anymore today. I can agree that God worked special miracles through the hands of the apostles. And he used them in amazing and unique ways to establish his church. I mean, the names of the 12 apostles are going to be written on the 12 foundations of New Jerusalem. So there's no denying that they are unique. If only the apostles were being used in the gifts of the Spirit, then I think that this argument could carry quite a bit of weight. But as we've already said, it wasn't just for the apostles, but for the church. So while I believe that the apostles were special, that does nothing to show that the gifts have ceased.
A fourth argument for cessationism is the nature of the miraculous gifts.
He says that the gifts of the Spirit today bear almost no resemblance to the gifts of the early church. I think that I can agree that much of what passes today as gifts of the Spirit is actually just emotionalism. And in my next video, I'm going to outline 5 pitfalls within the charismatic church. But just because even a majority of churches may handle things in the wrong way, it doesn't follow that there are no churches that are practicing the same gifts as the original church. He could not possibly know that no one is practicing the real New Testament gifts unless he visited every charismatic or Pentecostal church in the world. And even then, it would still just be his opinion unless he could show that all of these churches are doing things unbiblically.
A fifth argument for cessationism is the testimony of church history.
He says that the gifts of the Spirit were not mentioned much in the later books of the Bible, and they weren't mentioned much in church history, although he does admit that there are scattered reports. This is an argument from silence. Just because we don't have tons of reports doesn't mean it was not happening. But even if it was not happening, an argument from experience does nothing to overturn a clear teaching of Scripture. Also, we don't build doctrine on majority action or opinion. I think that there could be a lot of reasons why we don't see the gifts of the Spirit in operation very often in church history. And if you guys want me to do a separate video on that, let me know in the comment section below.
The sixth argument for cessationism is the sufficiency of Scripture.
Scripture is sufficient, and we don't need anything else. If God speaks, it is only through His inspired word. I also believe in the sufficiency of Scripture, which is why I believe in the gifts of the Spirit. If they were not taught in Scripture, I would not believe in them. I don't know anyone today that is saying that we need to add to Scripture. One of the requirements for a book to be added to the canon of Scripture was that it had to be written by an apostle or someone that had been approved by an apostle. These are men that Jesus hand-selected. Also, it had to have near universal acceptance within the early church. So there can be no new writings today that fit these two criteria.
There is a seventh and final argument for cessationism. It's the New Testament rules laid down for the miraculous gifts.
His argument is that there was order to the use of the gifts in the early church, and that most charismatic churches today seem to disregard these clear directives. This argument is similar to number 4, where he talks about the nature of the gifts. I can agree that sometimes things have gotten out of order, and that's exactly what was taking place in the Corinthian church. So Paul comes in and he addresses this chaos, especially concerning tongues. But his answer was not to say, no more gifts anymore, you've abused these things. His answer was to correct their bad theology and then exhort them to desire spiritual gifts for the edification of the church. And then he said things like, forbid not to speak with tongues. So to summarize, even if we accepted every single one of his arguments as fact, it still would not follow that the gifts of the Spirit have certainly ceased. There is just no biblical evidence to back up that claim. But I do think that we should take a deeper look at the principles behind some of his arguments. And that's what I'm going to do in my next video. I'm going to examine 5 pitfalls that we as Pentecostals or Charismatics could fall into. That video should be coming out within about a week or so. So if you don't want to miss it, please subscribe, turn on the bell notifications, and you'll be notified whenever it drops. Until then, thanks for watching.